You don't belong here. Move to economy, Veronica snapped, blocking James Anderson and his family in front of the entire first-class cabin. Passengers stared in uneasy silence, not knowing that the man she was humiliating wasn't just another traveler. He was the airline's owner, and her career was seconds away from collapsing. The boarding gate buzzed with activity as passengers moved quickly, eager to settle into their seats. Among them was a family of 3 James Anderson, his wife Celeste, and their 5-year-old son, Liam James, dressed in a tailored navy suit, carried a sleek leather briefcase. His demeanor exuded quiet confidence. Celeste, poised and radiant in a flowing ivory dress, held Liam's tiny hand as he skipped beside her. Giggling, the family looked forward to their trip, a much-needed break from their hectic lives as they stepped into the aircraft's first-class cabin. The polished interior shimmered under the warm cabin lights. James glanced at the seat numbers with a faint smile. "Here we are," he said to Celeste, guiding her and Liam to their seats. Passengers nearby offered brief, polite nods, and the Andersons began settling in. Celeste helped Liam climb into his seat, handing him a small toy airplane that lit up his face with excitement, while James stowed their carry-ons in the overhead compartment. A flight attendant named Veronica Summers observed the family from across the cabin. Veronica's sharp gaze swept over them, her lips pressing into a thin line. She adjusted her crisp uniform as if preparing for action, and strode briskly toward their seats. Her forced smile barely concealed the judgment behind her eyes. "Excuse me," Veronica said, her voice carrying an edge of authority as she addressed James. "May I see your boarding passes?" James turned to her calmly and retrieved the passes from his jacket pocket. "Of course," he replied with a polite nod, handing them over. Celeste looked up, sensing a hint of tension in Veronica's tone. Liam, oblivious to the exchange, played happily with his toy. Veronica examined the tickets with a scrutiny that felt unnecessary, her eyebrows knitted together as she double-checked the details. "First class," she questioned, her voice faltering slightly as if the words were hard to believe. James nodded once more, maintaining his calm. "Yes, these are our seats," he replied evenly. His tone was measured, but Celeste caught the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Veronica hesitated, her discomfort palpable. "I'm sorry, but I need to verify something with the front desk." "Please remain seated," she said curtly before turning and walking away. Her footsteps were quicker now, her movements tense, as Veronica disappeared behind the curtain. James sat back in his seat, his face unreadable. "What was that about Celeste?" asked softly, her voice laced with concern. James placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Probably a routine check." "Don't worry about it," he said, though there was a slight tightening around his mouth that suggested otherwise. In the galley, Veronica was on the phone with a ground staff member, her voice low but urgent. "I have a situation here," she said, glancing back toward the cabin. "There's a family in first class, and I'm not sure their tickets are valid." "Could you confirm their booking?" The ground staff member sounded confused. "The Andersons, their tickets were purchased weeks ago." "Fully confirmed. Is there an issue?" Veronica paused, struggling to hide her irritation. No issue," she muttered, ending the call abruptly. But instead of returning to the Andersons with an apology, her expression hardened. She adjusted her posture, taking a deep breath before heading back to the first-class cabin. When she approached their seats again, her voice was firmer. "I'm sorry, but I need you to step aside for a moment. There seems to be an error with your booking." Celeste's brows furrowed as she exchanged a glance with James. Liam looked up from his toy, confused by the sudden tension. James rose to his feet slowly, his calm exterior masking the frustration. "Brewing beneath what kind of error?" he asked, his voice steady. "I need to confirm your seating," Veronica said. Avoiding his gaze, she gestured toward the galley. "If you'd follow me, please." James hesitated but nodded, signaling Celeste to stay seated with Liam as he followed Veronica. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged curious glances. Sensing something unusual was unfolding, Celeste watched them go, her unease growing. Liam tugged at her sleeve, sensing the change in atmosphere. "Mommy, what's happening?" he asked softly. She smiled at him, though her grip on his hand tightened slightly. "Nothing, sweetheart," she said gently. "Daddy's just sorting something out." But in her heart, she knew this was far from routine. Something wasn't right, and her instincts told her the situation was about to escalate. In the galley, James stood calmly, his presence unshaken as Veronica fumbled with her words, "Sir." She began, her voice tinged with an unusual mix of hesitation and authority. "We're trying to clarify a seating issue. It appears that your reservation might have been flagged." James raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp yet controlled. "Flagged? I booked these tickets weeks ago, fully paid, and confirmed. What exactly is the issue?" Veronica crossed her arms, a defensive stance creeping into her posture. "It's not about payment, it's just that first class is a premium cabin, and we have to ensure all seating is accurate." James stared at her for a moment, processing the implication. His lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in disbelief. "Premium cabin," he repeated. "Are you suggesting that I don't belong here?" Veronica stiffened, suddenly aware of how her words might have sounded. "Of course not," she replied quickly, her tone sharp as if to mask her discomfort. "I just need to follow protocol." James took a deep breath, his calm exterior betraying a flicker of irritation. "Very well," he said, his voice steady. "Let's resolve this quickly. My family is waiting." Meanwhile, back in the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves. Celeste felt the weight of their stares, but kept her focus on Liam, who was now fidgeting with his toy. A middle-aged man seated across the aisle leaned toward her, his expression sympathetic. "Is everything okay?" he asked in a low voice. Celeste offered him a tight smile. "It's just a mix-up," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. The man nodded but cast a glance toward the galley where James and Veronica had disappeared, sensing that there was more to the situation than met the eye as James stood waiting. Veronica stepped away to speak with another flight attendant, a younger woman named Grace. Grace's brow furrowed as she listened, glancing toward James. Briefly, "Did you check the reservation system?" Grace asked her, tone cautious. Veronica frowned. "Yes, but it's not just about the ticket. Look at him," she whispered, gesturing L in James's direction. "Does he seem like the usual first-class passenger?" Grace's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You can't make those kinds of judgments," she replied firmly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If his ticket is valid, that's the end of it." Veronica huffed, brushing past Grace to return to James. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you and your family to move to the main cabin until this is sorted out." James tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that made Veronica hesitate. "Like I said, it's protocol," she replied stiffly, avoiding his gaze. James's patience wore thin, his voice lowered, carrying a firmness that made Veronica flinch. "If you're suggesting we leave first class, I expect a clear and valid reason, because at this moment it seems like you're acting on something other than protocol." Veronica opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by a sudden chime over the intercom. The captain's voice filled the cabin, calm yet commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we finalize some adjustments. We'll ensure your comfort for the remainder of the flight." The announcement barely registered with Veronica, who felt her composure slipping. James gave her a long, pointed look before pulling out his phone. "Excuse me," he said curtly, turning away as he made a call. His tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the authority behind his words. "Is this still the right time?" he asked into the phone after a brief pause. He added, "Good, proceed as planned." He ended the call swiftly and returned his attention to Veronica, his calmness now unsettling. "Shall we return to my family?" James asked, his tone polite but firm. Veronica hesitated, her confidence shaken. She nodded stiffly and led the way back to the cabin. But something about James's composure made her stomach churn as they approached the first-class section. All eyes turned toward them. James's return was met with murmurs, passengers clearly sensing the tension in the air. Celeste stood, her gaze meeting James in silent question. He gave her a reassuring nod, but there was a subtle shift in his expression that only she noticed, a look that told her the situation was far from over. Veronica remained uneasy as she escorted James back to his seat. Her mind raced, but she maintained her professional facade. Celeste greeted James with a quiet, questioning look, but he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Liam, sensing his father's return, beamed and resumed playing with his toy airplane, oblivious to the tension simmering around him before James could fully settle in. Veronica returned, her face set in determination. "Sir," she began, her voice clipped, "we've decided that it would be best for you and your family to move to the main cabin until we can fully verify your reservation." Celeste's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure, glancing at James to gauge his reaction. James took a slow, deliberate breath and looked directly at Veronica, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Our tickets have been verified. We paid for these seats in full if there's a valid reason for us to move." "I'd like to hear it now." Veronica hesitated, her confidence faltering under James's unyielding gaze. Other passengers began to take notice, their murmurs growing louder. An elderly woman a few rows away whispered to her companion, "They've been perfectly polite. What's the issue?" A younger man seated nearby interjected loudly enough for others to hear, "They're paying customers like the rest of us. Why are they being singled out?" The rising voices seemed to rattle Veronica further. "Sir, I don't want to escalate this," she said, her tone sharpening. "Please cooperate, or I'll be forced to involve security." Celeste's eyes narrowed, her patience clearly wearing thin. Before she could speak, James raised a hand, gently signaling for her to stay calm. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket with deliberate precision. "If you're calling security," he said evenly, "make sure they come prepared with an explanation." The challenge in his tone sent a ripple through the cabin. Veronica's face wrined slightly, but she held her ground. "Please gather your belongings," she insisted, her voice now betraying a hint of desperation. James locked eyes with her for a long moment before turning to Celeste. "It's fine," he said softly, his calm demeanor as steady as ever. "Let's go." Passengers watched in silence as James, Celeste, and Liam stood to collect their things. Liam clung to his toy airplane, his earlier excitement now dimmed by confusion. Celeste kept her head high, her expression unreadable as she held Liam's hand. James led the way toward the main cabin, his steps measured and deliberate. Even as the weight of countless eyes bore down on them as they walked, James reached into his pocket and sent a quick message on his phone, his face betraying nothing. They were directed to cramped seats in the middle row of the main cabin. James helped Celeste settle Liam into his new seat before sitting beside them. The contrast between the space and luxury of first class and the tight confines of the main cabin was stark. But neither James nor Celeste showed any outward reaction. Meanwhile, Veronica returned to the galley, her nerves fraying as she overheard the murmurs from first-class passengers. That wasn't right. One man muttered they had tickets. Why treat them like that? Another added, this is going to backfire. Veronica ignored the comments, but her discomfort grew as she reached the galley phone. It buzzed, startling her. She picked it up hesitantly, her voice shaky. "This is Veronica," she said. The captain's voice came through, firm and no nonsense. "Miss Summers, I just received a call from the airline's executive team. They've been contacted directly by a passenger on this flight. I need to know exactly what's going on." Veronica's stomach dropped. She stumbled over her words, her confidence evaporating it. "It was just a routine issue," she stammered. "I thought there might have been a mistake with their tickets." There was a long pause on the other end, and when the captain spoke again, his tone carried a warning. "You need to handle this carefully. We cannot afford a situation like this. This I suggest you tread lightly until further notice." Veronica hung up the phone, her palms sweaty. She glanced toward the main cabin where James sat with his family. His expression calm, but with a quiet intensity that made her stomach churn. For the first time, she felt the weight of her decisions bearing down on her, and the growing sense that she had underestimated who she was dealing with. James sat in the main cabin, his posture straight and composed, as if the downgrade to a cramped seat hadn't fazed him. Celeste sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on Liam's shoulder as he played with his toy airplane. Though outwardly calm, her sharp glances toward the first-class cabin betrayed her simmering frustration. James, however, seemed unbothered. He pulled out his phone, typed a brief message, and then leaned back, observing the situation with a quiet air of control. Back in the first-class cabin, the passengers' murmur had grown louder. A tall man in a tailored suit leaned toward Veronica as she walked past. That family had valid tickets. He said, his tone critical. What exactly was the problem? Veronica tried to keep her voice firm, though her nerves were clearly Fred, it's just a procedural matter. Everything's under control. The man frowned but didn't press further, though his disapproval was evident. Veronica hurried back to the galley where her colleague Grace was organizing refreshments. Grace shot her a disapproving glance as she handed over a tray of drinks. "You need to fix this," Grace said in a low voice. "That man isn't just any passenger. He's been calm, but I can tell he's not letting this slide." Veronica bristled. "I was just following protocol. It's not my fault if people can't handle being questioned." Grace set the tray down with more force than necessary. Her patience clearly wearing thin protocol doesn't mean you single people out based on assumptions, and now you've turned the entire cabin against you. Veronica opened her mouth to retort but stopped when the galley phone buzzed again. Her stomach twisted as she picked it up this time. The voice on the other end wasn't the captain's, it was the airline's executive office. "Miss Summers," a calm but firm voice said, "we've received a direct complaint from a passenger on your flight. It's regarding the handling of a seating issue in first class." Veronica's breath caught. "I was just following the voice." Cut her off sharply. "Save your explanations. You've removed a family with fully confirmed first-class tickets. The passenger in question is James Anderson. I suggest you look up his name in the system immediately." Veronica's hand trembled as she ended the call. She turned to the nearby service computer, her fingers fumbling over the keyboard. When James Anderson's profile appeared on the screen, her heart sank beside his. Name was a special designation executive level. Primary shareholder. Veronica's mouth went dry. This wasn't just any passenger. James Anderson wasn't simply wealthy. He was one of the airline's owners back in the main cabin. James watched as Veronica emerged from the galley, her face pale and her steps less confident. She approached their row hesitantly, her usual air of authority conspicuously absent. "Mr. Anderson," she began, her voice low and uneven. "I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience. It seems there was an error on my part." James turned to her slowly, his expression calm but unreadable in error. He repeated, his tone neutral. "You removed my family from first class. Based on what exactly?" Veronica swallowed hard, her words faltering. "I made a mistake in verifying your reservation. I assure you it won't happen again." Celeste looked at Veronica sharply, her composure cracking. "You embarrassed my family in front of an entire cabin. You made assumptions about us without any cause. Do you really think an apology is enough?" Liam looked up at his mother, sensing her anger, and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. James placed a calming hand on her arm. "Celeste," he said softly, his voice steady. "Let's not escalate this here." He turned back to Veronica, his gaze piercing. "I'll handle this matter directly with your superiors," he said, his tone controlled but firm for now. "We'll remain where we are." Veronica nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond. She retreated back to the galley, her steps quick and unsteady. The full weight of her mistake was sinking in, but she still didn't grasp how far-reaching the consequences would be. James leaned back in his seat, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had made his move, and now it was only a matter of time. Veronica returned to the galley, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter for support. The realization of who James Anderson truly was left her reeling. She replayed every interaction with the family, each one. Now a glaring indictment of her actions, she glanced nervously at Grace, who was watching her with a mix of disappointment and pity. "Did you know?" Veronica whispered, her voice shaky. Grace sighed, shaking her head no. "But it doesn't matter, you treated them unfairly, and now it looks like you're going to answer for it." Veronica's stomach churned before she could respond. The guy phone buzzed once more. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the receiver before finally picking it up. The captain's voice was tense. "Miss Summers," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've just received another call from the executive office. Mr. Anderson's identity has been confirmed and they're not happy. The instructions are clear. He and his family are to be reinstated in first class immediately, and you to personally deliver an apology." Veronica's grip on the phone tightened. Understood, she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper, when the line went dead. She leaned against the counter, her heart racing. Grace crossed her arms, her gaze unrelenting. "You brought this on yourself. Do the right thing before it gets worse." Summoning what little courage she had left, Veronica prepared herself. She adjusted her uniform and walked back toward the main cabin. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her as she approached the Anderson family. Passengers turned to watch, their curiosity palpable. "Mr. Anderson," Veronica again, her voice softer than anyone had heard it before, "on behalf of the airline, I'd like to sincerely apologize for the inconvenience in the way your family has been treated. It was an error in judgment, and I take full responsibility." Celeste raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Now you realize it's an error?" she asked, her voice cold. Veronica's face flushed, but she kept her tone professional. "The executive of office has instructed that your family be returned to first class immediately. I will personally ensure that your seats are ready and that no further disruptions occur." James looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then with a small nod, he stood and gestured for Celeste and Liam to follow. Celeste held Liam's hand tightly as they walked past Veronica, her back straight and her gaze forward. Liam, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, clutched his toy airplane as he skipped slightly beside his mother. When they reached first class, Veronica busied herself preparing their seats, ensuring every detail was perfect. She placed sparkling water on the tray tables and adjusted the pillows with trembling hands. James, Celeste, and Liam settled in, their demeanor calm but distant. As Veronica stepped back, she offered a final apology. "If there's anything else you need, please let me know." James nodded lightly, his tone polite but firm. "We'll let you know." Veronica retreated to the galley, her face pale and her nerves frayed. She had followed the captain's orders, but the damage was already done. The murmurs in first class had subsided, but the disapproving looks from the passengers lingered. Grace, standing quietly in the galley, shook her head as Veronica returned. "It's not over," Grace said quietly. "You know that." "Right." Veronica didn't respond. She knew Grace was right. James's calm demeanor wasn't one of forgiveness. It was the calm of someone who had already set the wheels of accountability in motion. And for the first time, Veronica understood that the repercussions of her actions were only just beginning as the flight settled back into a semblance of normalcy. Veronica tried to focus on her remaining duties, but her mind was clouded with anxiety. Every glance from the passengers felt like a silent judgment, every interaction a reminder of her earlier mistake. She glanced toward the first-class cabin where James and his family sat. They seemed composed, yet their presence weighed on her heavily. James, however, was far from passive, sitting upright in his seat. He tapped methodically on his phone, his movements deliberate beside him. Celeste leaned back, her expression unreadable, while Liam happily sipped juice from a small carton. The serene picture they painted only added to the growing unease in the cabin. Veronica wasn't the only one feeling the tension. Grace, quietly observing, had overheard murmurs among the first-class passengers. "Do you think they'll file a formal complaint?" one man whispered. To his companion, another passenger responded, "If it were me, I'd take it straight to the top in the galley." The phone buzzed once again. Veronica froze, the sound, now synonymous with dread. She picked it up hesitantly, her voice shaking. "This is Veronica." The captain's voice was sharper this time. "Miss Summers, I've just received another update from the executive office. Mr. Anderson's legal team is monitoring the situation closely. They've requested a full account of events and they'll be waiting upon landing. I suggest you prepare yourself." Veronica's grip tightened on the receiver. "Yes, Captain," she replied weakly before hanging up. The message was clear. James Anderson wasn't letting the NENT fade into the background. Back in first class, James finished typing another message and leaned back, finally setting his phone down. Celeste glanced at him curiously. "You've been quiet," she said softly, her tone filled with understanding. James looked at her, his expression calm but resolute. "This isn't just about us," he replied. "This is about accountability. People like her need to understand that actions have consequences." So Lee nodded, her gaze softening. She knew her husband's approach measured, deliberate, and effective. It was what had propelled him to where he was today. A man of influence who never tolerated injustice, no matter how small. Meanwhile, Veronica paced in the galley, her nerves unraveling. Grace approached her cautiously. "What's the plan now?" Grace asked. Veronica shook her head, her voice barely audible. I don't know. I never thought something like this would spiral so far. Grace's expression hardened. You should have thought about that before treating them the way you did now. It's out of your hands. Veronica glared at her but said nothing, the truth of Grace's words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. The remainder of the flight dragged on the hum of the engines, doing little to mask the tension. Passengers in first class occasionally glanced toward James and his family, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Others simply pretended not to notice, though their whispered conversations betrayed their interest as the plane began its descent. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. James adjusted his seat and leaned toward Celeste. This will be over soon, he said quietly. She gave him a small, supportive smile, her hand resting briefly on his. In the galley, Veronica stared at the clock, her chest tightening with every passing minute. She knew the landing would bring no relief, only more questions, more judgment, and likely more consequences. Grace's warning echoed in her mind. It's not over, and Veronica knew deep down that the worst was yet to come. The plane touched down smoothly. The familiar jolt signaling the end of the flight for most passengers, it was the start of a routine disembarkation for Veronica. It felt like the beginning of her reckoning. She stood stiffly near the galley, her hands gripping the counter as passengers began collecting their belongings. Her eyes flicked toward first class, where James Anderson remained seated calm and unhurried. Celeste leaned toward James as Liam sat quietly swinging his legs. What's the plan? She asked softly, her voice barely audible above the sounds of passengers preparing to leave. James's expression didn't change. We wait, he replied simply. Everything is already in motion as the first-class passengers began filing out. Many cast curious glances at James and his family. One man stopped briefly by James's seat, hesitating before speaking. I'm sorry for what happened earlier. He said, his voice low but earnest. It wasn't right. James looked up at him, offering a small nod. Thank you, he replied. The man nodded back and continued toward the exit, his expression thoughtful. Veronica stood near the plane's main door, forcing herself to smile at departing passengers. Each polite nod and murmured farewell felt heavier than the last. She couldn't help but glance back at first class, where James and his family remained seated. Their refusal to join the crowd of disembarking passengers made her stomach churn. The galley phone buzzed and Veronica jumped, startled. She grabbed it quickly, her voice cracking as she answered. This is Veronica. It was the captain again. His tone clipped. Security will be waiting at the gate. They've been briefed by the executive team. You're to stay on board and provide a full account of your actions. Do not leave the plane until instructed. Veronica's heart sank. Understood, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she hung up. Grace approached her, her expression. Grim, they're here, aren't they? Grace asked. Veronica nodded numbly. Security, the executives, probably the board. Grace sighed, shaking her head. I told you this wasn't over. As the last few passengers left the plane, the cabin grew eerily quiet. Veronica turned to see James rise from his seat, smoothing his jacket as he helped Celeste gather their belongings. Liam clutched his toy airplane tightly, looking up at his parents with a curious expression. Veronica stepped forward hesitantly, her voice shaking. Mr. Anderson, I want to apologize again for. James raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. His tone was calm but final. Save it, the people waiting outside will hear everything you have to say. Celeste shot Veronica a cold glance as she took Liam's hand and stepped into the aisle. James followed behind them, his presence commanding, without effort, as the family approached the plane's exit. Two uniformed security officers stepped aboard. They exchanged brief nods with James. Before their eyes landed on Veronica, Miss Summers, one officer asked, his tone firm. Veronica's throat tightened. Yes, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll need you to remain on the plane for questioning. The officer said, please follow us to the galley. James paused briefly at the door, turning back to look at Veronica. His expression remained calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that sent a chill through her. Without another word, he stepped off the plane, his family following closely behind as they disappeared into the terminal. Veronica felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. The officers gestured for her to move toward the galley, and she obeyed, her legs trembling. The realization hit her with brutal clarity. Her future was no longer in her hands as the Anderson family stepped into the terminal. The atmosphere shifted around them. The usual bustle of passengers was interrupted by the sight of two executives in tailored suits waiting nearby. They stood stiffly, their professional demeanor masking their nervous energy. One of them, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses, stepped forward to greet James. "Mr. Anderson," the man began, his tone apologetic but formal. "I'm Richard Hale, Vice President of Operations on behalf of the airline. I want to extend our deepest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you and your family experienced today. We are taking this matter very seriously." James nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Celeste stood beside him holding Liam's hand, her posture as composed as ever. "I trust you are," James replied, his tone calm but cutting. "This isn't just about us, it's about the standards your airline claims to uphold, and how they failed today." Richard swallowed visibly, adjusting his tie. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Anderson. We are already initiating a thorough review of our policies and training programs to ensure that nothing like this happens again. I assure you, accountability will be taken." James tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Accountability." He repeated, "That's exactly what I expect. I also expect to see tangible changes, not just promises. Words won't repair the damage caused by actions or assumptions." Richard nodded quickly. "We've already begun the process of reviewing the incident. The flight attendant involved will be questioned and held responsible for her actions if you have time. The CEO himself would like to meet with you to discuss this further." James glanced at Celeste, who gave a subtle nod of agreement. "Schedule the meeting?" James said, "I'll make time." As the Andersons walked toward the baggage claim, the executives lingered, exchanging uneasy glances back on the plane. Veronica sat in the galley, flanked by the two security officers. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the table in front of her. The air felt heavy and the silence was oppressive. One of the officers broke the silence. "Miss Summers, we're going to need a detailed statement about the events on this flight. The airline's executive team is already reviewing the complaint filed by Mr. Anderson." Veronica's eyes darted between the two officers. I didn't know who he was," she stammered. I thought there was an issue with their tickets." One of the officers frowned, his gaze steady. "Miss Summers, the issue wasn't with their tickets. The issue was with your actions. What made you decide to remove a family with confirmed first-class reservations?" Veronica hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the right words. Her voice came out weak and defensive. "I was following protocol. I thought they might have been in the wrong section. First class is its premium seating, and they—" She stopped herself, realizing how her words sounded. The officer's expression hardened. "And they—" What, Miss Summers didn't look the part? Veronica's face flushed. "No, I didn't mean that. I made a mistake. I didn't intend for this to happen." The second officer leaned forward, his voice sharper. "Intentions don't matter here. What matters are your actions, and those actions have consequences. Do you understand the severity of this situation?" Veronica nodded quickly, her throat dry. She felt cornered, every word she said seeming to dig her deeper into trouble. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just trying to do my job." The first officer exchanged a glance with his colleague before speaking again. "Your job is to ensure that passengers are treated with respect and dignity. What happened here today was the opposite of that." As Veronica sat in stunned silence, the weight of their words settled over her. For the first time, she began to fully grasp the gravity of her actions, not just for her own career, but for the harm she had caused to the Anderson family. Her stomach churned as she thought of James's calm, piercing gaze, and Celeste's quiet but powerful presence. She had underestimated them, and now she was facing the fallout. Meanwhile, in the terminal, the Andersons arrived at the baggage claim. Liam, holding tightly to his toy airplane, watched the conveyor belt with excitement. James and Celeste stood quietly, their calm exterior masking the whirlwind of emotions beneath the surface. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" Celeste asked, her voice low. James glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. They'll have no choice, he replied. The airline reputation is at stake now. If they don't act, this will become a much bigger problem for them. As the conveyor belt began moving, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, reading the notification. It was a message from his legal team confirming that the incident had already been escalated to the airline's board of directors. James's lips curled into a faint smile as he put the phone away. They'll act, he said simply, his tone carrying a quiet confidence. And if they don't, I'll make sure they regret it. The family collected their luggage and moved toward the exit, their steps steady and purposeful behind them. Whispers from passengers who had witnessed the early incident filled the air. Some expressed sympathy, others outrage. But one thing was clear: the events of this flight wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. For James, the day wasn't over yet. There were meetings to attend, decisions to make, and changes to enforce. As he stepped into the waiting car outside the terminal, he glanced back at the airport. One last time, the storm he had set in motion was only beginning. The drive away from the airport was quiet, but the weight of the day hung heavily in the air. James stared out the car window, his fingers drumming lightly on the leather seat. Celeste sat beside him, her hand resting on Liam's lap. As the boy dozed off, his toy airplane still clutched in his small hands, the hum of the car engine was the only sound. But James's mind was far from at rest. "We can't let this go," James, Celeste finally said. Breaking the silence, her voice was calm, but carried an edge of determination. "This wasn't just an insult to us, it's a reflection of something bigger. If this can happen to us, imagine how often it happens to people without the means to fight back." James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I've already set the wheels in motion. This isn't just about today, it's about setting a precedent." Celeste leaned back, her expression softening. She trusted James's methodical nature, his ability to turn personal affronts into broader change. But part of her still simmered with anger at the humiliation they'd endured. It wasn't just her, she added, her tone sharpening. It was the entire system that made her think she could act. That way, James turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "That's exactly what we're going to address," he said firmly as the car pulled into the driveway of their home. Liam stirred, rubbing his eyes and yawning. Celeste scooped him up, carrying him inside while James lingered in the car for a moment. He pulled out his phone and reviewed the messages from his legal team. There was already confirmation that the airline's board had been notified of the incident, along with an official statement from their public relations team expressing regret and promising immediate action. But James wasn't interested in hollow words or surface-level dam control. He composed a quick email addressed to the airline's CEO and copied to the board of directors. The tone was professional but unyielding. "The treatment my family and I experienced on Flight 237 today was unacceptable and reflective of deeper issues within your company. This is not about a single employee's behavior. It's about the culture that allowed such behavior to occur as a primary shareholder. I am requesting a full investigation into this incident and a detailed plan for corrective action. This includes the implementation of mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, the establishment of stronger accountability measures, and a public commitment to ensuring respect and fairness for every passenger. I will expect a formal response within 48 hours, outlining your proposed steps. Please understand that this is not a request. It is an expectation." After hitting send, James stepped out of the car, his mind focused on what lay ahead inside the house. Celeste was tucking Liam into bed when she rejoined James in the living room. She found him seated at his desk, already reviewing documents on his laptop. "Do you think they'll listen?" she asked, sitting across from him. "They'll have no choice," James replied, not looking up. "This isn't just a PR issue for them, it's a liability, and I intend to make sure they understand that." Meanwhile, back at the airport, Veronica sat in a stark conference room, her nerves frayed and her thoughts racing. She had been escorted there after the security officers finished their initial questioning. Now she waited for the airline internal review team to arrive. The room was cold and quiet. Save for the ticking of a clock on the wall when the door finally opened, 3 individuals entered: a man in a gray suit, a woman with sharp features and a clipboard, and a younger man who carried a laptop. They took their seats across from Veronica, their expressions neutral, but their presence imposing. Miss Summers, the woman, began, her tone brisk. We've been tasked with conducting a preliminary review of the incident that occurred on Flight 237. This is not a formal hearing, but we will be documenting your account in detail. Do you understand? Veronica nodded stiffly, her voice caught in her throat. Yes, the man in the gray suit adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. Let's begin with a basic question. What made you decide to remove Mr. Anderson and his family from their first-class seats? Veronica hesitated, her mind scrambling for the right words. I thought there was a mistake, she said weakly. I thought their tickets might not have been valid. The younger man typed something into his laptop, the sound of the keys echoing in the silent room. The woman with the clipboard raised an eyebrow. You thought, she repeated, based on what exactly? Veronica's face flushed. They didn't look like first-class passengers, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The woman with the clipboard exchanged a glance with her colleagues before speaking again. Miss Summers, do you understand how problematic that statement is? First-class passengers are not defined by appearance? Veronica nodded quickly, her palms sweaty. I realize that now, she said, her voice trembling. I made a mistake. I was just trying to do my job. The man in the gray suit leaned back, his expression unreadable. Your job, he said slowly, is to uphold the airline's policies and ensure a positive experience for all passengers today. You failed to do that in a way that has significant implications, not just for you, but for the entire company. Veronica stared down at her hands, the enormity of her mistake sinking in. She had thought she was exercising authority, but instead she had exposed the cracks in her judgment, and now she was facing the consequences. The review team continued questioning her for what felt like hours, dissecting every decision she had made during the flight. By the time the session ended, Veronica felt hollow, as if the life had been drained from her. She knew her future with the airline was hanging by a thread, and she wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. As she was escorted out of the room, she caught a glimpse of a large screen displaying news headlines. One caught her eye, making her stomach drop. Primary airline shareholder demands reform after discriminatory incident. On board, Veronica's heart sank. Further, it was clear this was only the beginning of the fallout. The news of the incident spread like wildfire. By the time the Anderson family arrived home, headlines were already flooding social media and news outlets. Titles ranged from airline in hot water after mistreatment of shareholders' family to discrimination on board, family forced to move despite first-class tickets. Each article painted a damning picture of the airlines, policies or lack thereof. James sat in his home office scrolling through the coverage. The response was overwhelming. Public sentiment leaned heavily in his favor, with users on social media expressing outrage and sharing their own stories of bias and unfair treatment. Many tagged the airline directly, demanding answers and accountability. James's phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages, but he ignored most of them, focusing instead on preparing for his meeting with the airline's CEO the following day. In the living room, Celeste watched a news segment that featured a panel discussion about the incident. This isn't just about a family being moved from their seats, one commentator argued. This is about the systemic biases that persist in customer-facing industries. The fact that this family had to endure such humiliation, despite having valid tickets, highlights a deeper issue. Celeste muted the television, her expression thoughtful. She turned to Liam, who was happily building a tower, with his blocks blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around them. She envied his innocence, but felt even more determined to protect it. The ordeal had shaken her, but it had also reminded her why they couldn't let this go. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, the executive team was in crisis mode. The CEO, Robert Lang, stood at the head of a conference room table. His expression grim around him. Senior executives poured over reports, media coverage, and social media analytics. The situation was spiraling out of control, and every passing hour brought more bad press. This is a disaster, one executive muttered, flipping through a stack of papers. We've had PR issues before, but this is different. This involves one of our primary shareholders. If we don't handle this carefully, we could lose him, and worse, our reputation. Robert held up a hand, silencing the room. What's the status on the internal review, he asked. His tone clipped. A senior HR manager cleared her throat. We've completed the preliminary questioning with the flight attendant involved. Her actions were clearly based on bias, though she claims it wasn't intentional. She's been suspended pending further investigation. Robert frowned, his jaw tightening. Suspended, that's not enough. We're dealing with a shareholder who has direct access to our board. We need to show decisive action. Another executive chimed in cautiously. We're preparing an official apology and outlining new training initiatives. We've already reached out to Mr. Anderson's team to schedule a meeting. Robert nodded, but his expression remained tense. Good. But it won't be enough to plate him. He's not just angry. He's a man who understands leverage. He's going to push for systemic change, and we have to be ready to deliver. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. They all understood the stakes. This wasn't just about resolving one incident. It was about addressing a culture that had allowed such an incident to occur in the first place. Back at her apartment, Veronica sat on her couch staring blankly at the termination notice on her laptop screen. The message from HR had been brief and cold. Your actions during Flight 237 were deemed a violation of our company's core values and customer service policies. Your employment with the airline has been terminated effective immediately. Her hands trembled as she reread the email, the words blurring together in the span of a single day. Her career had unraveled. The job she had prided herself on for years was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. Veronica's phone buzzed with notifications, texts from friends and family who had seen the news. Most messages were sympathetic, but a few were bluntly critical. She didn't respond to any of them. The shame was too heavy, and she wasn't ready to face the full extent of her failure. She turned on the television hoping for a distraction, but instead she was confronted with a news anchor discussing the incident. The words stung. The airline's handling of this situation has sparked outrage, particularly given the clear racial undertones of the flight attendants' actions. This is a stark reminder that unconscious bias can have real damaging consequences. Veronica switched off the TV, burying her face in her hands. She had thought her actions were harmless, that she was just following protocol. But now the truth was glaringly obvious. Her biases had blinded her, and her snap judgment had caused harm not only to the Andersons, but to the reputation of the company she once loved. For the first time, Veronica felt the full weight of what she had done, not just the loss of her job, but the damage she had caused to others. She picked up her laptop, hesitating for a moment before typing an email. The recipient was the Anderson family. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Anderson. She began, I am writing to apologize sincerely for my actions on Flight 237. I now realize how my biases influenced my decisions, and I deeply regret the hurt and humiliation I caused your family. My actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for them. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted to express her regret. After finishing the email, she hit send and sat back staring at the screen. It was a small step, but it was all she could do as night fell. James sat in his study, reviewing a draft of the airline proposed plan for reform. It was thorough, outlining mandatory training programs, new accountability measures, and a commitment to fostering a more inclusive culture. While it was a step in the right direction, James knew it would take more than words to enact real change. Celeste entered the room holding a cup of tea. Is this what you wanted? She asked, gesturing to the documents on his desk. James looked up, his expression thoughtful. It's a start, he said, but it's not enough, not yet. He set the papers aside and took the tea from her, his gaze softening. This isn't just about punishing one person, it's about ensuring no one else has to go through what we did. Celeste nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then let's make sure they follow through. James smiled faintly, the determination in his eyes unwavering. The fight wasn't over, but neither was his resolve. The next morning, James arrived at the airline's headquarters for his scheduled meeting with Robert Langston, the CEO. The building was sleek and modern, towering above the bustling city streets. A professional-looking assistant greeted James in the lobby, her demeanor respectful but visibly nervous. Mr. Anderson, she said with a slight bow of her head. Mr. Langston is expecting you right this way. James followed her through the polished corridors, his footsteps measured and deliberate. Employees. They exchanged furtive glances, aware of who he was and why he was there. When they reached the executive conference room, The assistant opened the door and gestured for him to enter. Robert Langston stood to greet James, extending a hand. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We deeply regret the circumstances that brought us here." James accepted the handshake, his expression calm but firm. "Let's get straight to it," he replied, taking a seat. "Regret is only meaningful if it's followed by action." Robert nodded, his face tightening. "I completely agree. Allow me to walk you through the steps we've already taken." He gestured to a large screen on the wall which displayed a detailed presentation. "Our response includes several immediate measures." Robert began first. "The flight attendant involved has been terminated. We've also launched mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, starting with customer-facing roles. Additionally, we're implementing a stricter accountability framework to address and prevent incidents like this in the future." James listened, without interrupting, his eyes scanning the slides on the screen. The proposed changes were comprehensive, but he wasn't ready to accept them at face value when Robert finished. James J.S. leaned forward, his hands clasped. "This is a step in the right direction," James said. "But let's not pretend that firing one person and announcing training programs will fix the underlying issues. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture of your organization that takes more than policy updates. It takes consistent, measurable change." Robert looked uneasy but nodded. "You're absolutely right. We're committed to ensuring this goes beyond serve-sur level adjustments." James tapped the table lightly, his tone steady. "I want monthly progress reports on the implementation of these changes. I want to see data, employee feedback incident, trends and measurable improvements, and I want an independent review conducted by a third party, not your internal team." Robert hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. "We can arrange that. Anything else?" James's gaze hardened slightly. "Yes, I also want a public apology, not just to my family, but to every passenger who has experienced discrimination while flying with your airline. This isn't just about me, it's about setting an example." Robert's expression tightened, but he didn't argue. "Understood. We'll issue a formal statement today." James sat back, his demeanor calm but commanding. "Good, I'll be watching closely, Mr. Langston. Don't mistake my cooperation for complacency." The tension in the room was palpable as Robert nodded once more. "We won't disappoint you," he said quietly as James left the headquarters. His phone buzzed with notifications. Social media was still abuzz with discussions about the incident, with hashtags like #airline accountability and #bias in flight trending globally. James scrolled through the posts, briefly noting the widespread support, but also the calls for deeper systemic change. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It had become a flashpoint for a larger conversation back at home. Celeste was seated at the kitchen table, her laptop open as she read an email from the airline's PR team. The message outlined their planned public statement, which included an apology and a commitment to addressing the issues raised by the incident. Celeste forwarded the email to James with a simple note. "What do you think?" James read it. As he entered the house, setting his bag down, he replied with a single word: "Adequate." Celeste looked up as he entered the kitchen, a knowing smile on her face. "Adequate," she teased lightly. "That's high praise from you," James chuckled, leaning against the counter. "It's a start," he said, "but there's still a long way to go." Celeste nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll follow through, or is this just damage control?" James's eyes narrowed slightly. "If they don't follow through, I'll make sure they wish they had, at the airline." The ripple effects of the incident were already being felt. Employees gathered in break rooms and hallways, whispering about the changes that were coming. Some were relieved, welcoming the focus on bias and accountability. Others were skeptical, doubting that a company so large could change its culture so quickly. Veronica, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Her termination had been the subject of quiet conversations among her former colleagues, many of whom expressed shock at how quickly the situation had escalated. But for those who had witnessed her actions firsthand, the consensus was clear. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were unavoidable. Grace, who had worked closely with Veronica on the flight, reflected on the ordeal as she prepared for her shift. She had always known that the airline's culture had its flaws, but seeing them so blatantly exposed had been a wake-up call. She vowed to approach her own work differently, ensuring that no passenger ever felt the way the Andersons had been made to feel that evening. As James and Celeste prepared for bed, Liam peeked into their room, his toy airplane clutched in his hand. "Mommy, Daddy," he asked, his voice small. "Are people still mad about what happened on the plane?" James knelt down, pulling Liam into a gentle hug. "Some people are upset, buddy," he said softly, "but it's because they want things to get better, and we're helping them do that." Liam nodded, his eyes wide. "Are you going to fix it?" James smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "That's the plan." As Liam returned to his room, Celeste looked at James, her expression a mix of pride and determination. "We are going to fix it," she said quietly. "Not just for us, but for everyone." James nodded, his resolve unwavering. "This isn't the end," he replied, "it's just the beginning." The following morning, news outlets buzzed with the airline's public statement, which had gone live overnight. The apology was thorough and direct, acknowledging the incident involving the Anderson family and outlining immediate steps being taken to address the broader issues. The statement read, "In part, we deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 237 involving Mr. Anderson and his family. This event does not reflect our values, and we are committed to taking meaningful action to prevent such situations in the future. Effective immediately, we are implementing mandatory training programs, strengthening our policies, and conducting a third-party review of our organizational practices to ensure equity and respect for all passengers." The statement ended with a direct apology to the Anderson family, recognizing James's role as a shareholder and, more importantly, as a valued customer who deserved better. Social media exploded with reactions, while some commended the airline for owning up to its mistakes. Others were skeptical, accusing the company of damage control. The hashtags number accountability matters and number fly fair continued to trend, fueling debates about systemic biases in customer service industries. James read the statement while sitting at the breakfast table, his expression thoughtful. Celeste, seated across from him with a cup of coffee, watched him closely. "Well," she asked, "it's a solid first step," James said, setting his phone down, "but now they'll have to prove they mean it." Celeste nodded, her expression serious. "And what about Veronica? Do you think she learned anything from all of this?" James paused, considering the question. "That's not up to me," he said finally, "but I hope she did. People like her are part of the problem, but they can also be part of the solution if they're willing to change." Meanwhile, Veronica sat in her small apartment, scrolling through the same news coverage. The public apology from the airline had done little to ease her sense of guilt. If anything, it deepened it. Every headline, every comment about the incident felt like a personal indictment. She opened her email inbox, rereading the message she had sent to the Anderson family the night before. There had been no response yet, but she hadn't expected one. She wasn't sure she deserved forgiveness, but sending the apology had felt necessary. A small step toward taking responsibility. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Grace. "Grace, I heard about your termination. I hope you're doing okay. This whole thing has been a mess, but maybe it's a chance to start fresh." Veronica stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Veronica, thanks, Grace. I'm trying. I have a lot to think about." Grace's reply came quickly. "Grace, if you ever want to talk, let me know. We've all made mistakes. It's how we learn from them that matters." Veronica set the phone down, her mind racing. Grace's words stuck with her. It's how we learn from them that matters. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but she knew she couldn't go back to who she had been before. Change had to start somewhere, and it had to start with her. At the airline's headquarters, Robert Langston stood in front of the board of directors, presenting the company's plan for reform. James sat at the end of the table, his presence commanding. Even in silence, the room was tense, as Robert outlined the changes being implemented, from the new training programs to the independent reviews. When Robert finished, he turned to James. "Mr. Anderson, we're confident that these measures will address the issues you've raised. We value your feedback and your commitment to holding us accountable." James leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "This is a good start," he said, "but it's just that, a start. I'll be watching closely to ensure these changes are more than just promises on paper." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to argue. James's influence was clear, and his resolve left little room for doubt. As the meeting adjourned, one of the board members approached James. She was an older woman with a kind but serious expression. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "I want you to know that some of us are on the board are fully behind you. This is the kind of accountability our airline has needed for a long time." James nodded, offering a small smile. "I appreciate that," he said. "Now, let's make sure it happens later that day." As James returned home, he found Celeste in the backyard, watching Liam play with a toy plane. The boy ran around, laughing as he mimicked the sound of an engine. James stood beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Meeting went well," he said simply. Celeste smiled. "I'm glad. Did you give them the usual no excuses talk?" James chuckled, something like that. They watched Liam for a moment in comfortable silence. Finally, Celeste spoke, her voice soft. "Do you think we'll ever stop having to fight these battles?" James sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Probably not," he admitted. "But every fight brings us closer to something better. And as long as we keep pushing, change is inevitable." Celeste leaned her head against his shoulder. "Well, if anyone can make it happen, it's you." James smiled, his gaze steady. "It's us," he corrected. "We're in this together." As Liam's laughter filled the air, the weight of the past few days began to lift. The journey wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. The ripple effects of the incident on Flight 237 continued to spread, transforming conversations about bias and accountability, not just within the airline, but across the aviation industry. News outlets reported on the airline's reforms, hailing it as a turning point for how companies address systemic issues. Other airlines announced similar reviews of their policies, spurred by the public pressure and the undeniable influence of James Anderson's actions. The Anderson family story became more than just a headline. It became a catalyst for change. Advocacy groups used the incident as a rallying cry, demanding better training and policies across customer service. Industries, social media platforms, buzzed with stories from passengers who had faced similar discrimination, their voices amplified by the spotlight on the airline's response at home. James and Celeste watched the developments with cautious optimism. It wasn't about the attention or the accolades. It was about seeing real change take root. Their fight had never been about revenge. It had always been about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what they had. One afternoon, James received an email from the airline's CEO. The subject line simply read, "Progress report." Inside the message detailed the initial results of the reforms. Mandatory training programs had been launched, with over 80% of employees completing the first phase. A third-party review had begun, and initial findings highlighted areas for further improvement. There was also a personal note from Robert Langston at the end. "Thank you for holding us accountable. Your insistence on doing what's right has made our company better, and we're not done yet." James forwarded the email to Celeste, adding his own note: "Step 1, complete on to Step 2 elsewhere." Veronica sat in a small coffee shop scrolling through job listings on her laptop. She had spent the week since her termination reflecting on what had happened. The regret was still raw, but she was determined not to let it define her. She had begun attending workshops on unconscious bias and diversity, hoping to better understand where she had gone wrong and how she could do better. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a reply from the Anderson family, one she hadn't expected. "Miss Summers." It began, "Thank you for your apology. While we cannot undo what happened, we appreciate your acknowledgement of the harm caused. Growth begins with accountability, and we hope you continue to pursue it." Veronica stared at the email, a lump forming in her throat. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. She closed her laptop, her resolve strengthening. She couldn't change the past, but she could build a better future, one decision at a time. A month later, James found himself on another flight with his family. This time the atmosphere was different. The staff greeted them warmly but without hesitation, their professionalism unwavering as they settled into their seats in first class. Celeste looked at James with a small smile. "Do you think they know who you are?" she asked playfully. James chuckled, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter if they do. What matters is that they're treating everyone the way they should." As the plane taxied down the runway, Liam leaned over, holding up his toy airplane. "We flying again, Daddy?" he exclaimed, his face lighting up with excitement. "Yes, we are," James said. Smiling at his son, he glanced at Celeste, her calm, radiant presence grounding him as always. This was what it was all for, not power, not recognition, but the simple dignity of being treated fairly as the plane lifted into the sky. James leaned back in his seat, watching the clouds drift past the window. He knew the work wasn't finished. There would always be more to fight for, more to improve. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that the journey they had started was already making a difference. And sometimes he thought that was enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.